Matthew chapter 10, the commissioning of the 12. So structurally, this point in the book of Matthew now begins a new section. Matthew 5 to 7 gave us the first discourse. Matthew 8 and 9 gave us Jesus' works. And now we're back to a discourse, the second discourse now, Matthew 10 and 11. The first of these discourses is focused on Jesus' commissioning of the 12. And that actually fits right in closely with the section that came just before. So Matthew 9 ended out that Jesus went throughout all the cities and the villages. He was teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. He was healing every disease and every affliction. So he's doing all of this, but there's just a limitation. He saw the crowds. He had compassion for them. There's too many of them. The harvest is plentiful. The laborers are few. Pray the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers into his harvest. These people like sheep in desperate need, pray that more laborers will be sent out. And that's a perfect transition into what happens now in chapter 10. The harvest is plentiful. The laborers are the limitation. So he called to him his 12 disciples, and he sent them. And he instructed them to go out, verse 6, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In fact, just a little bit later, he says that he is sending them out as sheep in the midst of wolves. In other words, the language of the people like sheep scattered without a shepherd, that language is getting picked up and carried into chapter 10. But what's more now, Jesus is the one who is sending the disciples, and that's the solution or the answer to his prayer. Pray that the Lord of the harvest would send out disciples or would send out gatherers for the harvest. One passing comment here that's striking is, what is it saying about Jesus? That he says something to the effect that the harvest is excessive. There are not enough laborers to deal with it. Pray to the Lord of the harvest. Who is the Lord of the harvest? When Jesus then himself turns around and sends out the disciples to gather the harvest. It's fairly evident that Jesus himself is the answer to this need. But before we get into more of the theology of this chapter, I want to talk about three questions or problems that can be, we'll put them in the category of confusions. Things that we look at in the chapter and we just wonder, what's going on here? Starting with this. You have a list of the 12 disciples. The interesting thing here is that this is one out of 4 different lists. The others appear in Mark 3, in Luke 6, and Acts 1. There are some variations within the lists. Certain patterns are striking. Simon or Peter always starts, Judas always ends. But some of the order and even some of the names are different. And if that troubles you and you wonder, why are there these differences in the lists? Probably it's just a function of some people having more than one title or more than one name that was used for them, which still exists or happens that way in many parts of the world today. The interesting thing about this list that makes it a little different than the others is that you'll notice pairs. So Simon and Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew. That's actually in the grammar or the structure of the way that this list is given. And that tells us, I think, that these disciples are sent out in pairs, that 2 of them go together, and then we have 6 pairs that have scattered out. In any case, just so that we understand, the differences do exist, but they're not problematic. The solution is probably just a difference in the names. Second, why did Jesus tell the disciples not to take anything with them? Okay, you get a little further down, and his strong admonition to them is that they should not take any money with them, not even a bag or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff. I mean, nothing. Go. And there are a couple of things that are interesting about this. Depending on the region that they would have gone into, this could actually be a real practical problem. Just to help us visualize a little bit, this is the synagogue in Capernaum. And in this case, then we would be talking about a relatively developed city, and so people being able to come in and find accommodation. That contrasting with some of the other regions, this is the Judean wilderness, and I would not expect the disciples to be traveling around out here because, well, you don't have people and there's no reason to go there. But you have to pass through some regions, depending if you are going down through Judea like this. And when you put that together, then you recognize that we're talking about something rather existential here. I mean, the idea of not really packing any kind of planning or money. You go, and now what do you have then as your place to stay? Now, it's interesting that if you go to other passages in Luke's record of a separate commissioning, Jesus commissions 70 and he sends them out and he tells them to take provision. So it's not that Jesus never wanted them to do this. Something different is going on here. And it seems that Jesus wants the disciples to be specifically dependent on those that they minister to, and specifically dependent on God's providence in directing their way. There is also probably a sense here that it's not a terribly long-term thing. And all of those points are relevant for reasons that we'll talk about in just a little bit. The third thing I want to talk about that's maybe a little troubling is that there's a pattern here with Jesus telling them specifically that they're not to go anywhere near the Gentiles. They're not to minister to the Gentiles at all. In fact, you see this language right here. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the focus is supposed to be specifically and intentionally Jewish. Why? Does Jesus not care about Gentiles? Well, there's some interesting details that are helpful here. Even within the chapter, verse 18, later on in this same chapter, you see that the disciples' ministry will eventually involve Gentiles. More significantly, as you go across Matthew, you see this constantly, that Jesus' ministry is heavily involved with Gentiles. In fact, already he has seen a harvest of response, positive response, both from Gentiles and specifically from Samaritans. So Jesus is not against ministry to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. In fact, he's already doing it, even before the time of this commission. There are some possibilities here for why this emphasis. Number one, there is a strong pattern across the New Testament of ministering to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. Romans 1:16 is a classic text that talks about this, but others as well. And the idea seems to be that with the Old Testament promises and the expectations, it's very important in the New Testament framework to demonstrate that, clearly demonstrate that the Jewish people rejected Jesus. And after their rejection, then you see the Gentile response, accepting Jesus. That's a pattern that's going to become very important in Acts, and it's a pattern that stretches across the Gospels. So it seems that Jesus intends to make it very clear that he has absolutely offered salvation to the Jewish people, and that by and large, many of them, maybe most of them, have rejected. There's also a possible explanation here that the disciples at this point in their understanding are very immature. They're not grasping what Jesus is doing. And it may even be that Jesus is giving them this as a protection for them. That were they to go into Gentile territory or Samaritan territory, and people responded to them and actually accepted the truth, that the disciples would not handle it correctly. Which explains some of why Jesus himself had already reached out to these groups, but he's now telling the disciples not to. And that then brings me into not just kind of concerns or confusions I want to resolve, but important emphases in the chapter itself. Starting out with this, we already emphasized Jesus' person and him sending out the disciples as the answer to his prayer, or the answer to his longing at the end of chapter 9. Remember, he looked out, he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. Pray that the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers, and then he does. Jesus sends out laborers. And that emphasis is important because now what we're going to discover is a strong emphasis in this chapter on Jesus' disciples' close association with him. What I mean by that is you discover that Jesus' ministry is now being extended in the ministry of the disciples. The disciples are not just ministering on their own, they are an extension of Jesus' ministry and Jesus' concerns. The first of many different data points that emphasize that would be that the disciples' miracles are going to be parallel to Jesus' miracles. So starting out in chapter 10, he called them and he gave them authority or power against unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Just notice how the language to this point has already said something like that about Jesus. Jesus went about all Galilee preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. They brought into him many that were possessed with devils. He cast out the spirits with his word. He healed all that were sick. He went about teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing every sickness and every disease among the people. And if I move back here, you see, again, this is exactly what the disciples are doing. So you find parallel wording intentionally grabbed here to say what Jesus has been doing is now what the disciples are going to do. Notice the disciples' message. Jesus commissions them to say, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But if you just go back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry started out, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's called the disciples to minister the exact same message that he was ministering. And if that's not clear enough, then you can see that Jesus explicitly and intentionally connects the disciples' ministry to his all the way through this chapter. So watch how this flows. You shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake. It's for the sake of Jesus. It's not you who speak, it's the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. You will be hated of all men for my name's sake. And it's getting even clearer now in verse 24. The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It's enough that the disciple be as his master, as the servant as his Lord. And I think the idea here goes, if you think back to Jesus' words to them, that they not take a bag or a staff, that they not prepare, but they need to just go and they need to trust the Lord's provision for them. Well, you see that emphasis also with Jesus, that the foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So one of the reasons that Jesus is telling the disciples not to prepare is that he's intending for them to follow the same kind of ministry that he followed. In fact, he's going to emphasize now that discipleship following him is costly. Verse 32, whoever will confess me before men, him will I also confess before my Father. Whoever will deny me before men, him also will I deny before my Father which is in heaven. To be associated closely with Jesus, to be like him, to be his disciple, means then that you are dependent or you're trusting in his representing you before the Heavenly Father. Matthew 10:37, now the concept is becoming very explicit. The person who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. The disciples must associate or affiliate themselves with Jesus so closely that Jesus now is their father, mother, brother, family. He that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And climactically stated, verse 40, he that receiveth you receiveth me. He that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. So I think the idea across this pattern is to say the disciples go as an extension of Jesus. Jesus' ministry is now expanded in the 12. It's not just about Jesus now, in the sense of Jesus only ministers, but it's the extension of Jesus' ministry through his representatives who minister on his behalf, so that ultimately it is all about him. But it's the ministers who represent him by being associated with him. And the point then that makes this very important is that Jesus' ministry is going to expand. Jesus' ministry will include many other people now. First, the disciples, the 12. But ultimately, if you read carefully through Matthew chapter 10, you see a pattern of even more. The ministry will expand far beyond just the 12 to the church, those who receive the 12. And you can read right down through chapter 10 with patterns that we've already read. The person who receives you receives me. Or the person who is worthy, who will accept their words. There's the sense now of Jesus' ministry expanding himself, the disciples, the church, that points us into the future. I said earlier there was an important point about Jesus cautioning them not to prepare or not to have any other assets as they go. And the distinction between that and Luke's record where he tells them to prepare. So what's the difference between these? And one of the core differences is parallel to Jesus' words elsewhere. When the bridegroom is with you, then you are there and you focus on the bridegroom. Later on, then that's a time when you can worry about other things. There's the sense during Jesus' ministry of a special urgency. The disciples must go. There is no time to spend planning for the long term. No, this is a short, intensive sprint. But when you get to the future, you discover a much wider kind of concern. The disciples to go out into all the world in a way that will require planning and intentional, careful, long-term thinking. And that's the last point I would like to highlight here, the distinction that's already being made or assumed here from Jesus about the future. So you have these sets of passages that give you the hint. Jesus is looking beyond just the few years of his own ministry. Watch Jesus' words here. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. You shall not have gone over the cities of Israel. You'll not run out of cities before the Son of Man comes. Jesus is aware, and he's already teaching, that he's going to return. Matthew 10:34, he's talking about him bringing peace upon earth. And he just comments here ultimately that the person who would follow Jesus must take up his cross and follow after him, and ultimately to lose his life. And what you've got then is this implication already within this chapter of Jesus' future ministry. He's going to die on a cross. He's also, though, going to transcend because he's going to have to return. So there's some kind of resurrection or some future life beyond the grave. And Jesus' return then is something awaited in the meantime as the disciples are supposed to go out. Waiting for his return, they go and continue to spread the message until his return. And you're getting then a picture that's just starting to come into focus. Jesus' ministry extends it's beyond just the years of his life. But there's a church, there's believers, there are people, other people, that will become disciples and will follow Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry then, extended through the ministry of his disciples, or let's put it in later New Testament terms, in the lives of the apostles, is pointing forward to the long term, the future. And the conclusion of chapter 10, I'm actually going to take us to chapter 11. The first verse of chapter 11 summarizes or completes this picture. After all of this commission, Jesus made an end of commanding his 12 disciples. He departed from there to teach and to preach in their cities. Jesus continues his ministry alongside of or parallel to the apostles now continuing their ministry. So that we're supposed to see the apostles' ministry as an extension of Jesus' ministry, while Jesus' own ministry continues, and ultimately pointing to the future when we're going to see many disciples come to become followers of Jesus Christ.